With the Mark Meadows text messages, boy, he was receiving a lot of them from members of Congress, the president's chief of staff.
Yeah, shocking stuff here, perhaps not surprising, but it remains shocking. Nearly 2 years after the January 6th insurrection, thousands of previously unseen text messages are revealing the lengths to which Republican lawmakers went in their efforts to overturn the 2020 election. Talking Points memo has obtained 2,319 texts that were turned over to the House January 6th committee earlier this year by former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows. They show Meadows in conversation with at least 34 Republican members of Congress, with many of those lawmakers sharing debunked conspiracy theories about a stolen election in order to help then-President Donald Trump stay in office. In one text sent to Meadows just 3 days before Joe Biden's inauguration, South Carolina Congressman Ralph Norman writes, quote, "Our last hope is invoking martial law. Please urge President to do so." It's unclear if Meadows responded to that message. He did, however, respond to a plan to overturn the election floated by Arizona Republican Andy Biggs. After Biggs raised debunked claims that a substantial number of illegal immigrants had cast ballots, Meadows responded, quote, "I like it." The texts also show extensive efforts by Pennsylvania Congressman Scott Perry to have environmental lawyer Jeffrey Clark installed as Attorney General in the final days of the Trump administration. You remember Clark was dismissed by the people at the Justice Department. If we have an oil spill, we'll let you know if we need you. After responding once to that, the text exchange shows Meadows ignored multiple messages from Perry. Included in those texts, a popular right-wing conspiracy theory about an Italian defense contractor stealing the election for Democrats. These texts have not been verified by NBC News, may be missing some context. NBC has reached out to those involved in the messages for responses. Joining us now, investigative reporter for Talking Points Memo, Hunter Walker. He's one of the reporters who reviewed those texts to Mark Meadows. Hunter, it's great to have you here with us this morning. So a couple of snapshots there from a couple of the members of Congress who are still there, by the way, and will hold real power in about a month or so. Can you just sort of give us a broad view of what these texts show? Beyond those snapshots, is that representative of what most of these members of Congress were saying to Mark Meadows?
Well, our story on the Meadows text is going to be a series that we roll out over the course of this week and perhaps beyond, because there's just so much in there. And the main takeaway, I mean, we were focused on members of Congress yesterday, but Meadows was engaging with people in local government, with right-wing activists, members of Congress, senators, House members. This was a broad plot at every level of government and really every level of the Republican Party. We see dark money groups. We see sort of street-level activists like Amy Kramer. And they were all, working together on various plans to overturn the election. The other big thing that I would point out here, and I think it's one of the most frightening thing about this message cache, is this is the tip of the iceberg. There are hints in the messages that this log that Meadows provided to the Select Committee is incomplete, particularly in his exchanges with Scott Perry. He talks about moving over to Signal, an encrypted messaging app. There are also, discussions that sort of seem to pop up out of nowhere and blatantly lack context. And, I'll break a little bit of news on Morning Joe this morning. I'm starting to become aware of multiple instances of things that should be in the log if it was complete that are not there. So what we're seeing is, a broad plot, particularly involving members of Congress, deranged conspiracy theories, questionable legal logic, and blatant authoritarianism. And that's just the tip of the iceberg.
So it reads like crazy, except for the fact that it had a direct line into the White House. And you're talking about the chief of staff and Mark Meadows being receptive to some of it, at least in what we've seen, saying, I like it. We know, based on the video we've seen, the testimony we've heard during the January 6th Select Committee, that he showed extreme cowardice that day, unwilling to stand up on January 6th to Donald Trump. So what was his posture to most of this? Was he open to all these conspiracy theories? Did he take some of it to the president based on what you've seen?
He absolutely did. We're going to publish a story today that includes a specific instance where a conspiracy theory seems to have gone directly from Mark Meadows' phone to the Oval Office and Donald Trump's Twitter feed. But also one of the more chilling ones in the stories we dropped yesterday involved Brian Babin. This is a Texas congressman. And I think one of the important things about all this, these texts have come out a bit in drips and drabs, but some of the most shocking stuff was from members of Congress that the public really isn't that aware of. You know, guys like Brian Babin, Ralph Norman, Scott Perry, who were really at the center of this and in direct communication with the Trump White House, and just are sort of off the radar of even people who've really watched the January 6th investigation play out. And in this exchange with Babin, he sends Meadows just a completely, thoroughly debunked conspiracy theory, I think, about Pennsylvania. And Meadows says, already forwarded it to the DOJ. So there were official actions taking place based on these messages, which in the case of, for example, Paul Gosar, were being based on stuff from InfoWars, Revolver, a site with, you know, a founder with white supremacist ties. And in the case of Gosar, I can't even say it on air, but a blog called Some Told Me. I mean, this is where members of Congress were drawing their information.
So, Hunter, as you went through these text messages, from the asylum wing of the Republican Party, it struck me in looking through the first batch that you've put out that there are, as you just alluded to, many of the people involved are still members of Congress sitting in the House of Representatives. In the rearview mirror, as you look at what they did, they tiptoed up to sedition. They were right there at the gate of sedition. What do they do now? What do they have to say now?
Well, you know, you're making a really important point, Mike. And one thing that, you know, people should note here is some folks actually got promotions. I mean, we see Ted Budd, who's a House member now, he's moving on to the Senate. We see people suggesting this guy, John James, who was running for office in Michigan, should lead the challenge there. Right. And he, you know, lost a race in 2020 and just baselessly, you know, said the whole race in the state needed to be investigated. Well, guess what? Now he won. Right? So we're seeing this wing in some instances gain power. When I reached out to people, it was notable to me. I mean, I talked to Ralph Norman, who sent one of the most eye-popping texts calling for martial law 3 days before Biden took office. And he sort of said, oh, that was 2 years ago. Send me the text and I'll get back to you. Of course, he didn't, as though you could forget calling essentially for troops to be sent into the streets, right? But one thing that was really striking was a lot of the members, including those that played a real leading role from what we saw in the text, Ted Cruz, Jody Hice, Jim Jordan, just totally ghosted us, right? The people who did respond were the few Republicans in the messages who were not among the 147 that voted to object to the election. And they all just sort of pointed to that. But this also showed that, you know, in the period leading up to that vote on January 6th, they were playing with fire.
Jen, Joe and I joke often about the Italian guy trying to influence the election, but here it is in the White House. I mean, I heard it around the time of the elections. A friend of mine, somebody I know and love, said, hey, why aren't you guys looking at the Italian satellite? A defense contractor living in Italy is alleged to have uploaded software to a satellite that changed votes from Donald Trump to Joe Biden. That was the theory. And we laugh about it, except here it is being pushed all the way to the White House. And by the way, don't forget, Donald Trump had DOJ look into that conspiracy theory.
I mean, that's the thing. Like, there's a number of things that strike me in hearing about this reporting, Hunter. The first is, as bad as we assume things were, when we get a little glimpse into reality, it's actually worse than we assumed. And it is easy to laugh about these things, except, as you said, forwarding this to DOJ, becoming part of the, not just becoming part of the record, but having the Department of Justice actually act on these things. And we saw how it ended up. And when you, I know that there's more text to come, but you do have a better glimpse than the rest of us about where this is going. And when you look at the totality of what you read, can you give us a sense of what picture sort of emerges for you that may be different than, because in a couple of weeks or sometime before Christmas, right, we're going to see the Jan 6 committee report. We're going to see more of this out in the open. What does it look like to you?
You know, I think we're touching on something that is really a central thing for me here. You know, I covered the Trump White House, and I think a big question was how many people are in on the joke, so to speak, right, and how many people are true believers. Well, I first became familiar with the text log when I was working on my book, The Breach, which is about the January 6th investigation. And I co-wrote it with Denver Riggleman, who's a former Republican member of Congress, and he was a staffer on the committee. So he knows a lot of these people. And he was shocked when he first opened the text log. He led the phone team, and he said, you know, it was like looking into the mouth of madness. And even with that sort of introduction, when I started looking at it, I had a similar reaction. I mean, we're seeing adults who are in government, not only engage in frighteningly undemocratic rhetoric, but their base intelligence, frankly, is called into question. I mean, you're talking about that wild Italian theory. People were taking it seriously. We see another instance that we're going to detail where someone has, a bizarre theory from a Romanian YouTube video that any of us would know not to tweet, based on stuff from 2005 that they somehow thought carried over to 2022. I mean, the information literacy of our members of Congress is called into question here. And that's part of why, we thought it was so important to present more of a totality of these texts than you've seen anywhere else before. And also, our tech team worked very hard to make sure you can see them in a phone as they were received, because the typos, the wild links, all of this is really important. And one last point I'll make, and this is really something that shouldn't be lost in this discussion. We see the pressure. We see it in real time in these texts that was on people like Doug Ducey, that was on people like Brad Raffensperger, that was on people like Arizona Attorney General Mark Brnovich. I mean, Scott Perry, the same guy who's sending this Italian theory, is talking about, lobbying to have Trump pressure the Italian government and Pennsylvania legislators. And, I think one of the things we see is that if these people had given in to the pressure, all of this plotting just might have worked.
So, Mika, the information flow following this is Scott Perry, United States Congressman, hears about some video. Somebody sends it to him about an Italian guy changing votes. He gets the video. He texts it to Mark Meadows. Mark Meadows brings it to the attention of the President of the United States. The President of the United States seeks the Department of Justice, using their time and resources to look into a YouTube video Scott Perry's friend sent him somewhere along the line.
It's just staggering. It would be a bad movie. The sad reality here is that it's not a movie. It's what happened during the Trump administration and January 6th. And Jonathan Lemire, this incredible reporting by Hunter Walker really lays out. I mean, this is the president's chief of staff. Is that normal to be hearing from dozens of members of Congress, conspiracy theories, number one? And what do you make of this text by Representative Ralph Norman about martial law? There are so many different ways to go here, but I'm just wondering what your thoughts in terms of covering the White House about the role of the chief of staff and what was going on here, what these text messages reveal.
The chief of staff in a normal White House is a gatekeeper, so it's not unusual for him to be texting with members of Congress. It is unusual for him to be texting about conspiracy theories and Romanian YouTube links. That doesn't happen too often. What we're seeing here from Meadows is that he also, as gatekeeper, allowed some of that stuff to get to Donald Trump. And that it also goes to show this is the big lie, and it has spent months in the making ahead of the election, and how after the election it accelerated with such force. That text you mentioned, Mika, from Congressman Ralph Norman of South Carolina talking about martial law, I'd like to flag the date on that. That's January 17th. That is after January 6th. The insurrection has already come and failed. There was already violence. Lives have been lost, and they're still talking about this martial law idea, one that Michael Flynn had floated a few weeks prior. Thankfully, it didn't come to be. Hunter, just wanted to ask you as a final question, and great work on the reporting. You mentioned, of course, this stuff has gotten the hands of the January 6th committee. But how about the Department of Justice? We know there's been some overlap and not always an agreement as to who gets what there. Do we believe that DOJ has this, and what might they do with it? Could there be potential criminal charges stemming from what we're reading here?
So reportedly, the DOJ does also have the Mark Meadows text log. I think, one of the million-dollar questions, and John, I know, we covered this together a bit, that hung over the entirety of the Trump administration is sort of what will government do about some of, the things that might be illegal, right? People love to throw around on Twitter that something's a crime. Well, it's only a crime if it's charged, right? And I think, you can see legally potential for action. I mean, a lot of people have raised the idea the Norman text is sedition. But, will the Justice Department be willing to take on members of Congress? Will the Justice Department, be willing to take an aggressive approach with that? And is that even healthy for democracy? So that's the million-dollar question. One thing I just want to point out, this was not just my reporting. We had a team of 5 reporters, Josh Kavinsky, Kayla Philo, Kate Riga, and Amina Ugel, who were working on this with me for 5 weeks, and there is a lot more to come. This is the tip of the iceberg of what's in the logs, but it's also the tip of the iceberg of what we're putting out on TPM this week. So, stay tuned. I think this is a really important story, and it's not over yet.
It's amazing reporting about your team. We know so much about the events around this election, but this just sheds even more light on it. Great work. Investigative reporter for Talking Points Memo, Hunter Walker. Hunter, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Mika?
So let's bring in NBC News Justice and Intelligence correspondent Ken Delaney. And Ken, of course, you're here also to talk about the grand jury subpoena to Brad Raffensperger, which we'll get into in just a moment. But this is so incredible. And Hunter's reporting and saying that this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what's to come with more information. If you could put into context, if you could, what these text messages and other revelations tell us about what the January 6th committee still can do, or what still could surface through the DOJ in terms of what you glean from these messages.
Mika, good morning. This is clearly something that the Justice Department is looking at as part of its January 6th investigation. And, we remember that the January 6th committee aired a lot of this in the hearing where they had the top former DOJ officials discussing all the pressure that was brought to bear on them by Donald Trump and the people around him to investigate. Remember, he said, just say the election was corrupt and we'll do the rest. And they refused to do that. But and so at the end, that may have been the closest we came to a real catastrophe had those Justice Department officials gone along and raised questions of fraud with the official Justice Department seal behind them. They didn't do that. So, look, it's not illegal for a member of Congress to pass along a wacky conspiracy theory and or even for Mark Meadows to pass that along to the Justice Department. But collectively, all of this behavior starts to look like a conspiracy to overturn the election. And that's the question. Even if an unsuccessful illegal conspiracy is still an illegal conspiracy. And that's, I think, what the Justice Department is weighing now, along with all this other conduct, because this is just one slice of what we know happened, as the January 6th committee laid out very well in those televised hearings.
And as Hunter said, there's more to come. We'll be watching for that.